Alright, welcome to the last of the video series of chapter number 4. Today we're going to tackle such exciting topics as what it's like to be English in England versus what it's like to be English in the colonies. When you're answering this question on your guide or readings, I'd like you to address each of these three components: the economy, cities, and class distinction. Those are all pretty important. The last two questions on your guide or reading are going to be these questions. What is the practice of benign neglect? And then what began the French and Indian War. Both these are pretty big catalysts in moving us, kind of putting us on the road to independence, moving us towards that American Revolution. So they're pretty important concepts. But first and foremost, let's talk about what it was like to be English in England versus what it was like to be English in the colonies. It should be noted that people that lived in the colonies, for the most part, enjoyed being English. They were proud of their English heritage. They may have had a few subtle complaints about the English government, but for the most part, they enjoyed being English. They enjoyed their English, like I said, English heritage. Now, there were some pretty big differences, particularly when it came to the economy. In England, they were starting to industrialize. They were starting to develop commerce. And because of this, they had big institutions like the Bank of England and big corporations like the East India Company that were big influencers on their economy. Nothing like that really existed in the colonies at this time. We would eventually get there, but nothing during this time in the 1750s. That just wasn't really happening. Now, even though there was commerce in England, most people still made money as farmers, just like they did in the colonies, where it was pretty much up and down the board. That's how you made most of your money. There's a big difference. In England, farming, people that owned them as businesses, which means they had big chunks of land that they grew like huge surplus of products that they sold for profit, or they would rent that land to tenant farmers, again, for profits. Americans didn't necessarily operate that way. Americans were very much middle class. Most of them owned their own land, but they didn't own a ton of it. So most American farmers were able to grow food to sustain themselves from year to year, maybe make a little bit of profit so they could buy tools and seeds for the next year and other products that they may need. But there wasn't a lot of extra, but they were mostly middle class. So again, a distinct difference was this gap between rich and poor. Not much of a gap in the United States, or I'm sorry, the colonies. We're not the United States yet. We're going to get there. Not much of a gap between the wealthy in the colonies and the people at the bottom. There were still people that were poor, and then there were people that were wealthy, but the wealthy in the colonies did not match the level of wealthy in Great Britain. Now in Great Britain, we see a very few people control a large chunk of the wealth. About 2/3 of actually British citizens are kind of fighting for survival. They are those tenant farmers. They're just working. They're employees of people on the farms. So they're just making enough they're trying to get by and not necessarily doing a good job of it. So there's a big disparity of wealth in Britain, not so much in the United States. To put this in a little bit of context, I know this is often a complaint I think a lot of countries have, but I know we do have it in the United States, where people talk about disparity of wealth. And we do have like the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, and we do have poverty. But we also have a lot of people in the middle class. So yes, if you look at from top to very, very bottom, there's a big disparity, but we do have the vast majority of us are middle class. So the disparity of wealth, like present day United States, is nothing compared to what we're talking about in Great Britain, where literally it was a couple versus, like, again, 70% of the population. There was a lot of trade between the two, between colonies and England. And remember, like, England had a monopoly on trade with the colonies. The colonies weren't allowed to trade with other countries. They might have smuggled a few things in, like tea and some sugar and molasses from other places, but for the most part, all they did was trade with England. And England gave them pretty good deals on things. So they had a pretty good trade arrangement. So it kind of worked out for both parties, kind of made each other money. So the economies were linked in kind of that way. And there is a growing kind of need and a growing want for fine goods that were produced in England, like teapots or furniture. Now, not everybody could afford the big stuff, but people would oftentimes indulge themselves in like tea or that sort of thing. All right, let's talk about cities. There is a distinction of English cities versus colonial cities. And really, it's all about size. London is a gigantic city, about 675,000. Again, to put that in perspective, it's about the size, population-wise, of like Wyoming. So a lot of people lived in London as a big metropolis. Metropolis. About 90% of American towns had 2,000 people or less. So in America, not the size cities that they have in Great Britain. Okay, and there are some major distinctions in classes. We've kind of touched on this already under the economy section, but just to make sure you get it. Class distinction, much more pronounced in England, where they had the upper class that controlled like 70% of the wealth, and it was a very, very small percentage of the people. And then they had like 70% of the people were poor, just barely, just fighting for survival, hoping to get there, not doing a great job of it. In the colonies, about 3/4 of the people were middle class. They owned land. Again, nobody's getting super rich. There's a few people, but there wasn't a lot of people that were crazy poor either. So, for sure. Both of these people, again, started looking for finer things like manufactured goods and that sort of thing. So, it's the way things tended to work. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how we were governed in the colonies. This is a little different. There was a practice kind of known as benign neglect that occurred in the colonies. And what we mean by that is we were neglected. Like people in England didn't really care what went on day to day. There was a lot of bureaucratic agencies that had control over colonial affairs, like the War Office about protecting the colonies, or people that looked over trade, or people that looked over to see what kind of laws were being made in the colonies. But for the most part, they were like, whatever. Like, we're getting our duties on things. We're getting, they're paying us our taxes, whatever. Like they didn't really care a whole lot. They had a lot of agencies that weren't communicating with each other. Just didn't really seem to care a whole lot. They kind of let us do what we wanted to do. Now they did appoint like royal governors. I will just say this: the royal governor was supposed to be almost like the equivalent of like the king and queen of England. They were like the executive branch, kind of like the president. Now, unlike the king, they didn't have a lot of power. They were appointed by England, didn't really have the political contacts to kind of fight back, and they weren't always like the most skilled like politicians or skilled governors. They didn't necessarily care to. They were just like, whatever, I'm collecting my salary, life's good. Didn't really put up a lot of a fight. In the colonial government, most of them had what's called a bicameral legislature, which means there are two houses. Just kind of like present day Congress is a bicameral legislature. They have the House of Representatives and the Senate. This bicameral legislature was set up of the lower house, which is kind of like more common people. That was known as the Assembly, and then they had the upper house, which were nominated by some kind of wealthier, more powerful people that were known as councils. They set kind of the rules and regulations of kind of what went on. Okay, that's how we were governed. Now let's talk a little bit about the French and Indian War. This is again going to start leading us down that path of independence. Kind of like the idea of benign neglect. Benign neglect leads us down because we get really used to governing ourselves. We don't really want England sticking their nose into our business, and when they start to do that, it's going to rub us the wrong way. French and Indian War is kind of one of the reasons they start sticking their nose in our business. And the French and Indian War was really, very simply, it was a quest to halt French expansion. Now they had been at war with France. England had constantly been at war with France. The French and Indian War is really just a war between in the colonies. It was kind of set in the colonies, and again, it wanted to stop French expansion. Now France had made their way down to the Ohio River Valley, and they really were going to begin pushing east. Why Britain wanted to push west. I almost got my directions mixed up there for a minute. So they're kind of, again, you see one going this way, one going this way. Eventually they're going to collide. So There's a young general by the name of George Washington. He's going to play a big part in American history coming up, who's sent to kind of stop the expansion in the Ohio Valley. He sets up this very crude fort. It's called Fort Necessity, and he loses. He loses pretty badly. He wants to be kind of a bigwig in the British Army, and he feels like his military career is over, and he goes back to his farm and figures his career's done. Little did he know, he has some highlights kind of left in him. So we'll talk about those later. The command is given to a guy by the name of William Pitt, who again doesn't really do any better job of driving the French out. He really wants to dominate the French. Dreams of by doing that, it's going to lead to financial dominance as well. Really, all it leads to is constant fighting in the colonies. And like I said, there's this push east by the French and west by the English. And again, it's all about who wants to dominate financially in the colonies. And it's going to lead to constant chaos. So as we're kind of going through this, it's going to lead to, like I said, constant chaos. But eventually, it's going to lead to major changes in the colonies. That's going to get people thinking about independence and eventually lead to the American Revolution. So, okay, that's it for Chapter 4. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. If not, I will see you in Chapter 5.